Chapter 1, Shadows of the Past. The city skyline gleamed under the haze of streetlights and neon signs, casting long shadows on the streets below. In the heart of the urban jungle, crime was a constant companion, but so too was its silent enemy, the American Shredder. Once a master of terror, feared across the underworld, he had now become a man in search of redemption. His days of ruthless domination had ended, replaced by quiet solitude in the dojo hidden beneath the city's grimy surface. The clink of steel against stone echoed in the dim light as he practiced. Every strike, every block, was a meditation, a reminder of his former life, and a pledge to never return to it. He had believed that severing ties with his past would bring peace, but peace was a fleeting illusion. His former partner, Lucia, was a shadow from that past, and now, she was a specter haunting his every step. She had once been his equal, a woman who had fought beside him in their shared vision of rule, but her betrayal ran deep, and she was now his greatest threat. As the rumor spread, whispers of Lucia's rising power reached him, her ninjas moving in silence, conquering the underworld, and spreading fear. She had built an empire, and at its center was vengeance. He had abandoned her, and now, she sought to destroy him. There was no running from this. The shadow of his past had returned, and this time, there would be no escape. Chapter 2, The Blade and the Shield. The first strike came swiftly and without warning. Lucia's ninjas, a deadly force trained in her brutal school of discipline, descended on the streets like a storm. They were a well-coordinated group, precise in their every move, each one skilled enough to strike fear into the heart of any ordinary warrior. But the American Shredder was no ordinary warrior. The moment the first ninja lunged at him in a dark alleyway, his blade met theirs with a resounding clash. He spun, his shield sweeping across in a defensive arc that deflected another strike. He was a force of nature, a man whose past had been carved from blood and fear, yet here, in the heart of his city, he was trying to protect what was left of his soul. His movements were a dance, fierce, swift, and unyielding. The cold steel of his blade cut through the air, and with each strike, a ninja fell. But these were not mere foot soldiers. They knew his tactics, his strategies. They were as skilled as he had once been, and it showed. He couldn't afford to underestimate them. His shield absorbed blow after blow, while his sword sliced through the air, only to meet the walls of trained resistance. These weren't the weaklings he used to deal with, these were shadows he had once helped create. After the last of the ninjas fell to the ground, motionless, the American Shredder stood alone in the alley, his chest heaving with exertion. Blood stained his armor, his blade still dripping from the battle. He turned his attention to the alley wall, where a message was carved, "Face me, or they keep coming." Lucia had issued her challenge. The battle had only just begun. Chapter 3, The invitation. The trail left for him was unmistakable, leading him high into the mountains where his past was buried. A temple once shared by warriors, where honor was taught and the path of the blade was refined, now stood as a monument to a past that could not be erased. And there, in the center of it all, was Lucia. She stood waiting, her silhouette illuminated by the soft moonlight that filtered through the temple's ancient windows. Her eyes, cold as ice, met his with the weight of old memories. Once, they had fought side by side, each a reflection of the other. But that was a lifetime ago, and the woman before him now was a stranger, one who had embraced a darkness he could no longer accept. "You were once a god among warriors," she said, her voice thick with disdain. "Now, you hide behind a shield like a coward." The words cut through him, but he did not flinch. Instead, he gripped his sword, its weight a comforting reminder of his new path. "I walk my own path now. I no longer follow the ways of the past." She sneered. "Then you're a fool." Without another word, she moved. Her blade met his with a clash that echoed through the temple, a stark reminder of their shared history. Their combat was a brutal dance, each move an extension of the violence they had once embraced. But the American Shredder was no longer the man who reveled in such bloodshed. He fought with restraint, holding back the rage that threatened to surface, keeping himself grounded in the man he had become. The fight was fierce and relentless, but in the end, Lucia disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the echo of her words behind. This is only the beginning. Chapter 4, The Hunt Begins. The message was clear. Lucia was no longer playing games. Her forces moved with a precision that rivaled his own, and the city was her battleground. As the days passed, the American Shredder watched the chaos unfold. Her ninjas took control of key criminal organizations with ruthless efficiency. The underworld was reshaped in her image, a world forged in fear and intimidation. This was no longer just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the soul of the city. But for the American Shredder, this was a personal war. He knew Lucia better than anyone. She was a mirror of his darkest self, a reminder of the brutal methods they had once used to claim power. He had turned his back on that life, but she hadn't. She was still the same ruthless woman, the one who had stood beside him when they carved their names into the city's history. As he hunted her lieutenants one by one, he learned more about her plans. She was methodical in her approach, each move calculated, each strike precise. She was building something, an empire, but not just of crime. She was reshaping the entire city to suit her vision. And at the center of it all was power, a power she intended to wield with an iron fist. But the American Shredder couldn't let that happen. He couldn't allow her vision to come to fruition. He needed to stop her. But how? She had anticipated his every move. She knew his tactics, his weaknesses. This time, brute force alone wouldn't be enough. He had to outthink her, outmaneuver her in ways she couldn't predict. The hunt had begun, but it was no longer just about the physical confrontation. It was a battle of minds, and only one of them could emerge victorious. Chapter 5, The Breaking Point. The city seemed to hold its breath as Lucia's war escalated. The American Shredder's tactics had disrupted her plans, but every victory came at a cost. The more he dismantled her operations, the more desperate she became. She knew he would come for her, and she was prepared. Lucia lured him into a trap, using innocent lives as pawns in her game. She captured civilians, those who had nothing to do with their war, and placed them at the heart of her empire. The message was simple: if he wanted to save them, he would have to face her. The American Shredder had no choice. He couldn't let innocent lives be lost because of his fight with her. He stormed the heart of her fortress, his shield raised high, his blade flashing through the night. Her forces swarmed him, overwhelming him with sheer numbers. Each time he cut one down, another took their place. They were relentless, but so was he. The temptation to let go, to embrace the darkness once again, was overwhelming. His old rage, the one that had once driven him to conquer and destroy, stirred deep within him. Lucia's words echoed in his mind: "You belong in the darkness, just like me." It was easy to fall back into that familiar place, to let the anger consume him. But then, he remembered why he had walked away in the first place. He wasn't the man he used to be. He couldn't let her win. With a surge of strength, he broke free from the trap, cutting through the last of her forces and escaping into the night. Chapter 6, A Shield Against the Darkness. Lucia's forces had been dealt a significant blow, but they were far from finished. Her empire continued to spread, her influence reaching further with each passing day. The American Shredder knew that to stop her, he couldn't rely solely on brute force. He had to become something more. He had to be smarter, more elusive. He became a shadow in the night, striking swiftly and silently, dismantling her operations from within. Each victory was a quiet one, a message sent without words. He used his shield not just as a weapon, but as a symbol. His actions were calculated, designed to make her question everything she had built. Her empire was crumbling, piece by piece, and she knew it. But Lucia wasn't one to give up easily. She had always been one step ahead, and now she was growing desperate. Her frustration grew as the American Shredder continued to elude her, refusing to face her on her terms. She demanded a confrontation, but he wouldn't give it to her. Not yet. The battle between them had become a game of cat and mouse, each side waiting for the other to make a mistake. But the American Shredder knew that mistakes were for those who acted impulsively. He had learned patience. He had learned to wait for the perfect moment. And when that moment came, Lucia would find herself facing a foe she couldn't predict. Chapter 7, the final gauntlet. Lucia had finally forced his hand. In a desperate move, she captured innocent lives, civilians who had no part in their war, and used them as bait. There was no longer any room for hesitation. The American Shredder had to act, or more lives would be lost. The final battle began. The American Shredder stormed the heart of Lucia's empire, a fortress built on fear and darkness. Her ninjas attacked from all sides, but he cut through them like a force of nature, his shield blocking their strikes, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. Each blow was a message to Lucia. This was the end. He fought his way deeper into the fortress, his heart pounding in his chest. And there, at the center of it all, stood Lucia, waiting for him. She was the same woman he had once fought beside, the same woman he had once loved. But now, she was his greatest enemy. Their final duel was unlike any before. There were no words, no taunts, just two warriors, one fighting for redemption, the other for control. The battle was fierce, each blow striking with the weight of their shared history. The American Shredder fought with everything he had, but it was clear that this was a fight he could not win by strength alone. In the end, only one would remain standing. And that would be the end of their story. Chapter 8, The Fall of Lucia. The final clash between the American Shredder and Lucia was a battle that seemed to last an eternity. Their blades clashed, their shields struck with a force that echoed through the dark corridors of Lucia's fortress. The fight had grown personal, every strike infused with years of pain, betrayal, and love lost. They were not just enemies, no, they were mirrors of each other, two warriors shaped by the same brutal world, fighting for two opposite visions. Lucia's strength had always been in her ruthlessness. She fought without mercy, without hesitation, but it was the same trait that had once drawn him to her. She was a force of nature, untamed and wild, but she had let that power consume her, twisting her into something unrecognizable. The American Shredder's movements were no longer fueled by rage but by restraint. He had walked away from the darkness long ago, but Lucia was still trapped in its grasp. And yet, he couldn't ignore the part of him that still felt that familiar pull. The desire for power, the thrill of domination. He was tempted, almost drawn back in by the darkness she wielded so effortlessly. But as the battle raged on, he saw through her, saw the woman she had become, not the one he had loved. She had become the embodiment of everything he had fought to escape. She was no longer the partner he had once stood beside, she was an enemy, a tyrant who had built an empire on fear. With a final, decisive strike, he knocked her to the ground. Lucia fell to her knees, breath ragged, her strength slipping away. Her once proud eyes were filled with bitterness as she whispered, "You were supposed to be more than this. You were supposed to rule." The American Shredder looked at her, torn between old emotions and the reality of what she had become. "That's not who I am anymore," he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. Lucia's laughter was hollow, bitter. "Then you are weak." With those words still hanging in the air, the American Shredder turned away, leaving her behind. Her empire lay in ruins, and though he knew she would return, it was a victory he had earned, one that came at the cost of his own soul. She was defeated, but he couldn't help but feel that part of him had been lost in the process. Chapter 9, A Warrior Without a War. The war was over, but peace eluded the American Shredder. The city that had once thrived on fear now seemed empty, devoid of purpose. He had won the battle, yes, but at what cost? The empire Lucia had built had crumbled, but there was no celebration, no relief. Instead, there was only silence, the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed, leaving only destruction in its wake. As he stood on the rooftops, overlooking the city, the American shredder felt a deep sense of emptiness. The battles he had fought, the wars he had waged, they were all gone now. His shield, once a symbol of his strength, now felt like a burden. His blade, which had been used to conquer, now felt like an instrument of regret. He had no allies, no one left to stand beside him. He had turned his back on the life of crime, but that didn't mean the darkness had disappeared. It lingered in the corners of his mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as long as it existed, as long as there were shadows in the world, he knew he would never truly be free. The city below him was no different from the one he had once ruled, it was still full of corruption, full of darkness. But this time, he wasn't the one holding the reins. He was an observer now, watching as the world continued to turn, as the shadows slowly crept back into the corners of the city. And in those shadows, he knew evil would rise again. He had stopped Lucia, but he couldn't stop everything. For now, there was no war, but he knew one day, it would find him again. And when it did, he would be ready. He always was. Chapter 10, The Never-Ending War. Lucia was gone, her empire destroyed, but the American shredder knew the war was far from over. It was a war that would never truly end. The darkness that had once consumed him still lingered in the world, and as long as it did, his fight would continue. He was not a hero, not a savior. He was a weapon, crafted in the fires of battle, tempered by loss. The city, still recovering from the war, seemed to hold its breath, but the American shredder knew better. Corruption would always remain, evil would always find a way to resurface. The battle for the city was never truly over. It was a cycle, a never-ending war between light and dark, between those who fought to protect and those who sought to destroy. And so, he fought. Alone. As he walked through the streets, his shield resting at his side, the American shredder's mind was filled with memories of what he had lost, of the choices he had made. He had turned his back on the darkness, but it had never truly left him. It was a part of him, a part that would always be with him, whether he liked it or not. He knew that the day would come when Lucia, or someone like her, would rise again, seeking to plunge the world into chaos. And when that day came, the American shredder would be ready. He would fight once more, not for glory, not for revenge, but for the simple reason that it was all he knew. It was his purpose, his calling, and it was a war he would never truly escape. As long as there were shadows, the American shredder would fight.